Frost had already found the corners of the gas station windows on Water Street, and Marnie Kessler stood third in line, with a crumpled 20 in her coat pocket and a court date reminder folded twice in the other, when the man ahead of her tried his card a second time and the machine blinked red. He was tall, dressed like money that had forgotten to dress like money. A good wool coat gone soft at the elbows, no gloves, hands red from the wind coming off the harbor. He tried the card again anyway, the way people do when they're hoping the machine changes its mind. The cashier, a kid named Dougie who'd gone to school with her cousin, said he was sorry, real sorry, but he couldn't run it a third time. The man had a bottle of water, a phone charger, and a small tin of aspirin on the counter, and he was saying something quiet about a lost wallet and a bank that wouldn't answer its own phone line on a Sunday. Marnie set her 20 on the counter before she'd finished deciding to, for his things, keep whatever's left for the tip jar. She ran through the door before he could turn around, the bell over it, still swinging when the cold hit her properly, and she remembered, with the particular clarity of a woman who has learned to keep close track, that the 20 had been meant for gas, and that gas was now a problem for tomorrow instead of today. The drive out to Glace Harbor took 19 minutes if you caught the lights right on the Sydney Road. Marnie caught them right. She parked the Corolla behind the row house on Bellevue Street, the one she and Tomas had rented the summer before Poppy was born, and never gotten around to leaving, and sat with the engine ticking for a moment before she went in. Poppy was at the kitchen table, coloring in the margins of a spelling worksheet instead of doing it, 7 years old, and stubborn about the wrong things in exactly the way her father had been. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, Sprout. How's the spelling coming?" "I know how to spell everything already." "Making it more interesting." "Fair enough." Marnie set her bag on the counter and did not, this time, walk past her daughter to the bedroom the way she sometimes did when the day had been the kind that needed 5 minutes alone with a door closed. She stood in the kitchen instead and opened the fridge out of habit, found half a bag of shredded cheese, 4 eggs, and a jar of partridgeberry jam her mother had sent down from Terra Nova 2 Christmases ago that neither of them had worked up the nerve to finish or throw out. "Can we do pancakes tomorrow?" "We can do pancakes tomorrow." She had said this before, on nights when the answer required more optimism than arithmetic, and it had always, so far, turned out to be more or less true. They had grilled cheese for supper and watched 20 minutes of a documentary about narwhals before Poppy brushed her teeth without being told twice and let her mother braid her hair in the crooked way she liked best because, she said, the crooked way looked like it had a story in it. After she was down, Marnie sat at the table with the lights off and did not do anything for a long while. She thought the way she tried not to let herself about Tomas. 3 years gone now, the boat, the radio call that had come in wrong, the way grief settles eventually not as a wave but as a kind of weather you simply live inside. She thought about the man at the gas station and the sound underneath his voice when the machine blinked red, a sound she recognized because she had made it herself once in a hospital corridor in Sydney, trying to explain to a social worker why she couldn't remember her own address. She checked her account before bed out of the same grim habit that made her check the stove twice. $211. Rent in 11 days. The severance from the plant, thin as it was, wouldn't land for another week and a half. The math was tight the way it had been tight for 3 years, tight in a way she had gotten disciplined about not flinching from. Dominic Fairweather went back to the gas station on Water Street on the Monday, though he told himself he was going for the aspirin he'd never gotten. He had not slept especially well over the weekend, and he had told the small, dishonest part of himself that this was the audit committee's fault, the 4 unreturned calls from Halifax, the board seat that had gone strange on him 6 months earlier and never gone right again. He knew, somewhere more honest, that this was not the entire truth. He asked the kid at the counter for the security footage, and Dougie, who recognized him from the business page of the Cape Breton Post more readily than Dominic would have liked, pulled it without ceremony. 41 seconds. A woman in a green plaid coat set a folded bill on the counter and left before anyone could get a proper look at her, but the parking lot camera caught the back of a silver Corolla with a North Shore Fisheries Co-op decal peeling off the rear window, half its lettering gone to salt and sun. By early afternoon, Dominic was standing in the trailer office of the North Shore plant on the Causeway side, talking to a foreman in a Carhartt jacket who answered his questions, because Dominic had walked in like a man used to answers being given to him. Kessler. Quality inspection. Laid off 3 weeks back in the last round. Good worker, quiet, kept to herself. Why do you want to know? She left something behind at the gas station. I'd like to return it. The foreman gave him the look of a man who had decided on principle not to be curious and told him he didn't hand out addresses. Sorry. Dominic thanked him, went back to the car and called his assistant. Winifred Doucet had been running his family's affairs for 34 years and needed all of 8 minutes to turn a license plate into a name and an address on Bellevue Street. The sky over the harbor had gone the color of wet slate by the time he knocked. Marnie opened the door and went very still, in the particular way of someone recognizing a face out of context before she could place why. He held out the folded 20, creased the same way she'd folded it, and a thick, cream-colored envelope. I wanted to bring this back and to give you that. It wasn't a gift you get to return. You didn't have it to spare. I could tell. I gave it anyway. That's what makes it mine to give. She didn't take the bill from his hand, but she didn't press it back at him either. And that, she said, nodding at the envelope, I don't need. I'm not looking for charity. It isn't charity. It's a thank you. It's still a thank you I don't need. He set the envelope on the porch railing instead of insisting and turned to go, the 20 still folded in his palm. He'd made it down 2 of the 3 steps when he stopped. The front window was lit gold from inside, and past Marnie's shoulder he could see a strip of the living room. A worn plaid sofa, a small purple backpack slung over a chair, and against the far wall, a low bookshelf with maybe a dozen books on it. 3 of them with spines he recognized without needing to read the titles properly. Above them, lying flat, a slim gray-jacketed volume with the title in small block letters, Cooperative Trust Architecture in Maritime Pension Design. The author's name ran along the spine in white, M. Kessler. He stood there for exactly 3 seconds. He did not let his face change. He climbed back up the 2 steps. I forgot to say thank you properly. He held her eyes a moment longer than the sentence required. Something behind them had shifted and did not go back to where it had been. Marnie, who was nobody's fool, noticed him noticing. He went down the steps a second time and got into the car parked at the curb, an old and unremarkable Jeep that told her nothing about who he actually was, which she understood later had been entirely deliberate. When his taillights turned the corner, she picked up the envelope. Inside there was no money, a heavy card embossed, Dominic Fairweather, Chairman and CEO, Fairweather and Doucet Maritime Group. On the back, in small, careful handwriting, when you're ready. She took it inside, sat down at the kitchen table and looked it up on her phone. The first result that came back was an obituary 7 months old. Julian Fairweather, 71, sudden cardiac arrest. She read it once, closed the browser and sat a long time in the dark. He didn't call for 4 days. She told herself she wasn't waiting and knew she was lying about that too. On the Thursday, her phone rang while she was restocking shelves at the pharmacy where she'd picked up part-time hours, and she stepped into the stockroom to take it. Blue Anchor Coffee, Charlotte Street, 3 o'clock. If you don't come, I won't ask twice. She came. He was already at a table by the window when she walked in, a plain wool sweater instead of the coat, no watch on his wrist. She noticed later he'd taken it off and set it face down on the table, which she understood without being told. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Thornfield Capital Partners has been pressuring my board for 5 months to spin off our legacy trust holdings. $2.1 billion in assets. Just under 9,000 beneficiaries. Fishermen, cannery workers, lighthouse keepers. Most of them retired. Most of them in Cape Breton, Digby, the Northumberland Strait. They want it broken into 3 parcels and sold to secondary buyers. Their stated reason is shareholder value. Their actual reason is that they think the trust structure has a weakness they can pry open. What weakness? An audit trigger pathway. The kind you documented in that paper of yours. He didn't look away when he said it. I need someone who understands the defense architecture down to the level it was built at. I have lawyers. I have analysts. None of them know it the way the person who designed it does. I inspected haddock fillets for a living until 3 weeks ago, Mr. Fairweather. I have a 7-year-old and a mortgage, and I do not have room in my life for Halifax boardrooms. I'm offering 3 weeks, consulting. $50,000, no name on any filing, full confidentiality both directions. After 3 weeks, whether it works or not, you walk. She looked out at the harbor. A ferry was easing in against the wind. I have a daughter to raise. I made a promise about that. I'm not the person who wrote that paper anymore. He didn't argue. He stood, put on his coat, and set a 20 on the table before he left. She noticed he had to dig for it in his wallet and he caught her noticing. I lost my card at the Halifax airport 2 weeks back. Banks had every account frozen pending verification since. I don't usually carry cash. I don't usually need to, he walked out. She sat there another 10 minutes before she paid for both coffees with a 5 and a fistful of change, the way a person pays when they're counting. That night over grilled cheese again because it was easy and she was tired, Poppy asked if she was sad. No, Sprout. Thinking, same thing sometimes. Marnie looked at her daughter a long moment and almost said something else and didn't. She read her the chapter where the old dog explains, gently, that some things end and some things but stay, and Poppy fell asleep with her head against her mother's arm before the chapter finished. Marnie carried her to bed, then sat in the dark kitchen a long while before opening her laptop and typing Thornfield Capital Fairweather. She read for 20 minutes. The shape of it came up slow and then all at once. Filings dressed up as minority shareholder concern, a coordinated push toward the audit committee, 3 separately timed letters from concerned institutional investors inside a 6-week window built to force a mandatory risk reclassification. Once that review opened, it would be cover enough to argue for a forced sale. It was almost exactly the playbook she'd warned about in the paper she'd written the year before Tomas died, a playbook she'd first seen used against a smaller trust in Nova Scotia in 2015, one that had lost and where 300 retired shipyard workers had watched their supplemental health coverage vanish within a year of the breakup. One of them had been her own father's foreman. Her father had called her about it, furious and helpless in equal measure. She did the math the way she used to do it professionally, and the numbers stopped being abstract the way they always did once you put real faces behind them. 9,000 people, average age 66. If Thornfield's buyers weren't obligated to carry the health record forward, the coverage most of those people were counting on could be gone inside a year. She called him at 7 the next morning. "I'll listen," she said, not promising anything. "But I'll listen." There was a small breath on the other end that wasn't quite relief, something steadier than that. "Saturday morning," he said. "I'll send the address." The 4th floor of the Fairweather building on Esplanade had a small, unmarked conference room that most of the staff didn't know existed. Winifred Doucet was already there when Marnie arrived, silver-haired, reading glasses on a chain, pouring tea with the economy of someone who'd done it in that room for 3 decades. Mrs. Kessler, a pleasure. Marnie didn't recognize her. She was certain she never had. What Winifred didn't say, and what Marnie had no way of knowing, was that 30 years earlier, Winifred had been one of 11 junior analysts on a Halifax pension file where the man running the room had barely looked up from the structure he was building. Her hair had been dark then. She hadn't expected to be remembered and hadn't been hired at Fairweather and Doucet on the strength of that history. She'd earned this seat on her own, 26 years running. Dominic pushed 3 binders across the table. Filings, internal risk classifications, 14 months of audit committee correspondence, redactions his own. "Tell me what you need pulled and I'll pull it." Marnie read for 2 hours without speaking, pen down, pages turned at uneven intervals and never out of order, the way she used to read, the way she hadn't let herself read anything in 3 years. At the end of it she closed the last binder and looked up. "You have a leak. 4 sign-offs show up in Thornfield's filings inside 96 hours of internal approval. None of the 4 had a public reason to know what was in those documents. I'm not naming anyone yet. I want to be sure of one of them first." Winifred set her teacup down. The small china sound was loud in the room. "Take whatever time you need," Dominic said quietly. That night, in the garage of the row house, Marnie pulled down a box she'd taped shut and labeled in black marker 3 years earlier. Inside was an old phone, dead for years. She plugged it in and watched it wake up slowly the way old phones do. One unheard voicemail dated the previous April, 6 months before Julian Fairweather's death. "Mrs. Kessler, this is Julian Fairweather. I've read your paper 4 times. I'm not asking you back into anything. I'm asking you to call me before something happens I can't undo. My number is..." She sat on the cold garage floor a long time. At 10 that night, Winifred knocked at the door on Bellevue Street with an olive folder under her arm. "I owe you an introduction I didn't give you Saturday," she said, once she was seated and hadn't touched her tea. "Years ago I worked under you briefly at a different firm. You won't remember me. There were 11 of us. I'm not telling you this so you'll trust what's in this folder on faith. I'm telling you so you know what I've done. I've done from inside this work, not outside it. She opened the folder. On top, photocopied from a leather notebook in a careful, aging hand, 3 lines. Find Kessler. Trust angle. Before Thornfield moves, Marnie's name circled twice. Mr. Fairweather was my employer for 31 years. He started writing in that notebook about 4 months before he passed. He'd approached 3 restructuring firms. Every one of them had some tie to Thornfield money. Yours was the only clean name on his list. He asked me not to reach out to you himself. He wanted to do it. Winifred's hand stayed still in her lap. He had a clean cardiac workup that spring. I'm not accusing anyone of anything I could prove in a courtroom. I'm telling you what I know and what I don't, and I'm leaving the difference between them where it belongs. Mr. Fairweather needs your name now. I promised him I'd wait until he did. She let herself out into the cold without finishing her tea. At 11:30, Marnie called Dominic. They were on the line 30 minutes and spoke for less than 5 of them. The rest was the particular quiet of 2 people listening to each other not say anything. He didn't ask if she was in. She didn't say. When they hung up, both of them already knew. For 7 days she came in through the loading dock off Prince Street at 6:30 and was gone by 4, home in time for the school bus at the corner of Bellevue and Kings. What she built in layers. The first layer moved the legacy trust off the company's direct balance sheet and into an independent fiduciary trust, governed by a 3-person board drawn from the Atlantic Actuarial Society and a retired federal magistrate, bound by a 15-year poison pill covenant. Any attempt to sell, split, or restructure the trust inside that window would trigger automatic full disbursement to the 9,000 beneficiaries at par. There would be nothing left for anyone to buy. The second layer required an 80% supermajority for any liquidation vote. The Fairweather family, through Dominic and holding instruments Julian had set up decades earlier, controlled 44%. Julian had cultivated relationships worth another 18. The rest would fall in line not out of loyalty but because the threshold made anything else a personal liability. The third was a tripwire, a fiduciary breach clause that would fire automatically if any officer signed a document tied to sale or restructuring without unanimous board consent, stripping the signer of position, severance, and options in one motion. She built it without saying so out loud for the company's chief operating officer, a man named Corwin Ashby, whose name had come up twice too often in the leak. On the 4th day, Winifred handed over the server logs. 6 outbound files over 4 months from Ashby's machine to an address buried 2 shell companies deep, tracing back to a numbered subsidiary of Thornfield Capital. The most recent attachment was the trust's internal risk assessment, sent 5 days before Thornfield's latest letter to the board, a letter that cited that same assessment by name. Marnie didn't call the police. That wasn't the fight in front of her. The fight in front of her needed a Monday morning boardroom. On the Friday night, she brought the final draft up to the 22nd floor. Julian's old office sat at the end of the corridor, glass on 3 sides, the lights of Sydney Harbor gathering below in their small orange constellations. Dominic stood at the window with his back to the door. "My father should still be here," he said without turning. She stood a step behind his shoulder. She didn't touch him. "He tried, that's why I'm standing here." He didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, "Go home to your daughter." She went home to her daughter. At midnight, her phone buzzed. "Need your signature on 3 documents, notary present. He works Saturdays. I can come to you." 7:30? She wrote back fine and didn't sleep well. At 7:25 Saturday morning, she was already in the kitchen in an old sweater, the griddle warming, a yellow bowl by the stove. She hadn't bothered to check whether this was, technically, a workday. Poppy came down at 7:28 in mismatched socks and stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "Mom, there's a fancy car outside." "I know, Sprout. Work thing. Good work thing, I think." The doorbell rang before Marnie could get to it. Poppy got there first, looked up at the man on the step, and considered him the way she considered substitute teachers. "You're the guy from the gas station." Dominic, who had not been prepared for this, went very still. "Mom told me. Mostly the part where your card didn't work." "That's the right guy," Dominic said. "You should come in. We're doing pancakes." He came in. The notary arrived 7 minutes later, stamped 3 signatures, took a coffee at the table, and left inside of 10 minutes. Nobody moved for a while after that. Marnie set a plate down for Poppy, one across from her for Dominic, and sat with her own. "Syrup on top or in the little bowl?" Poppy asked him gravely. "On top." Poppy nodded once like a suspicion confirmed. "That's the right way." She told him at length about a hamster named Biscuit who bit anyone who wasn't gentle with him, which everyone at school already knew, and Liam Doran kept forgetting on purpose. Dominic listened to every word of it. When Marnie set down her coffee cup half a second slower than she'd set down the last one, he noticed, and didn't say anything about that either. Nobody said the word Thornfield. Nobody said Ashby. Nobody said board. The October sun moved across the kitchen wall the small, precise way it does on a Saturday when, for one morning, nothing at all is wrong. At 9:15 he said he had to go. Poppy walked him to the door because she had decided unilaterally that this was the kind of guest who got walked to the door. When his car pulled away, she turned to her mother. "Is he coming back tomorrow?" Marnie knelt down to her height. "I don't know, Sprout." "I hope so. Me too." Poppy ran upstairs to brush her teeth, satisfied, as though the matter were settled. The Fairweather and Doucet board convened on the 22nd floor at 10 Monday morning. 11 chairs under a portrait of Julian's grandfather, 2 non-voting attendees present, Roland Pemberton of Thornfield holding just over 5% of voting shares, and Corwin Ashby in his capacity as chief operating officer. Winifred stood at the back with a manila folder and a face that gave away nothing. Dominic opened the meeting himself and read 2 short paragraphs into the minutes. As of 5:40 Friday evening, the Legacy Trust had been lawfully transferred, by valid corporate action, into an independent fiduciary structure. It had been registered with the province that morning. It could not be reversed for 60 days, and after that only by an 80% supermajority. Roland Pemberton stood, a tanned, unhurried man who had clearly prepared several versions of a speech about long-term value. He got out 3 words before the side door opened. Marnie walked in a charcoal blazer Dominic had pressed for her without telling her, a single folder under her arm. She stopped at the corner of the table nearest the door. "For the record," Dominic said, "I'd like to introduce the architect of the trust structure I've just described. Marnie Kessler, formerly of the Atlantic Pension Consortium, author of the paper the strategy against us was built on, and the paper the defense was built on, too." Pemberton's face didn't move. Marnie opened her folder and laid a printed copy of her own work on the table. "I wrote the paper your firm is using, Mr. Pemberton. I also wrote what's stopping it. Today's the first time I've seen both of them in the same room." He sat back down. Dominic nodded once to Winifred, who crossed the room and set her folder in front of Corwin Ashby. He read for perhaps 9 seconds. His face went the color of the tablecloth. "You have 2 hours to clear your office," Dominic said quietly. "The disciplinary committee will reach out by Friday. You'll sign nothing on this company's behalf before then. Security is outside." Ashby left without a word, his shoulders very straight. Pemberton, looking at no one, said he'd like to formally withdraw the offer his firm had extended on the 14th. "The minutes will reflect that," Dominic said. The meeting adjourned at 10:34. It had taken 34 minutes. 3 weeks after the gas station on Water Street, on a bright, hard blue Tuesday, Dominic walked Marnie down the executive corridor of the 22nd floor to a door that hadn't been opened since April. He held out a small ring of keys, Chief Trust Officer, Co-Chief Executive, Fairweather and Doucet Maritime Group. "The board approved it this morning," he said, unanimously, including 2 members who were leaning toward Pemberton 6 months ago. She took the keys. "This isn't for the $20. I know. It's for the fact that you gave it to a stranger on a day you mathematically didn't have it to give." She went in and didn't sit at the desk right away. She walked the room's perimeter first, the way a person walks a space they expect to be in for a long time, and paused at the bookshelf, still mostly Julian's, half empty of books and full of small things nobody had had the heart to box away. When she finally opened the top drawer, out of the plain reflex of someone taking a seat, she found a single folded 20 inside, and beside it a small index card in Dominic's handwriting. A date, the name of a gas station, nothing else. He had never spent it. She looked at it a long moment. She didn't pick it up. She closed the drawer. That afternoon at 10:04, Poppy came through the lobby doors in a red coat, her hand in Winifred's, because Winifred had picked her up from school on Dominic's asking and liked walking children into important buildings. Dominic was waiting by the elevators. He crouched down to her height. "Hi, Poppy. Hi." She studied him a moment with the careful, unblinking attention 7-year-olds reserve for people who matter. "Are we doing pancakes again Saturday? I'd like that. Same syrup rules?" "Same syrup rules." She nodded once as if that settled it and reached for her mother's hand when Marnie came around the corner. The three of them walked toward the elevators together, and neither of the adults said a word about the half-second their hands brushed out on the way, or about what it was they weren't saying. They had both learned the hard way that the things that lasted were rarely the ones that needed saying out loud at all.